September 15th, 1940, 11:47 a.m., 22,000 feet over the Kent countryside. Pilot Officer Colin Gray had a Messerschmitt Bf-109 locked in his sights. 400 yards out, distance closing fast. The German hadn't spotted him yet. Gray's thumb rested on the firing button. 3 seconds to effective range. The Messerschmitt's nose suddenly dipped into a steep dive. Gray followed without hesitation, pushing his stick forward hard, feeling the negative G-forces pull him up against his harness. His Rolls-Royce Merlin engine coughed once, then died. The propeller spun uselessly in the slipstream. The gun sight drifted away from the target. 1,030 horsepower vanished in a heartbeat. Gray swore under his breath. He knew exactly what had just happened. Every single RAF pilot knew. The carburetor had flooded. The engine had been starved of fuel for 2 seconds, maybe 3. His Spitfire was now nothing more than a glider. The Messerschmitt pulled cleanly out of its dive and disappeared into cloud cover. The German pilot never looked back. He didn't have to. He knew the British fighter couldn't pursue. Gray's engine caught with a rough splutter and roared back to life. His 5th confirmed kill had just slipped away, not because of superior German flying, but because of a flaw in British engineering. He touched down at Biggin Hill 20 minutes later, filled out the exact same maintenance report he'd submitted twice before. Engine failure during negative G maneuver. Duration, 2.3 seconds. Enemy aircraft escaped. The report would be added to 2,300 others sitting in a filing cabinet at the Air Ministry. 2,300 documented engine failures during just the Battle of Britain. 2,300 moments when British pilots became sitting ducks in the sky. Buried somewhere in that stack of reports was the answer to why so many young men weren't making it home. But identifying the problem wasn't the issue. The issue was that nobody seemed able to fix it. Nobody except one woman working in isolation in a laboratory at Farnborough. A woman the majority of the RAF had never even heard of. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, and she was about to violate every protocol in the Air Ministry's rulebook to save their lives. The defect was straightforward. The consequences were catastrophic. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, powering every Spitfire and Hurricane, relied on an SU carburetor with a float chamber design. Under normal flight conditions, gravity naturally drew fuel down into the engine. The system functioned flawlessly. But aerial combat was anything but normal flight. When a pilot committed to a dive, negative G-forces threw everything upward, fuel included. The fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The float sank to the bottom. The valve opened completely. Fuel flooded the entire system and drowned the supercharger. The engine quit. 1 second, sometimes 2. Sometimes just long enough for a Messerschmitt to circle back and punch cannon shells straight through your cockpit. The Germans faced no such limitation. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 engine utilized direct fuel injection, no float chamber, no flooding. A Bf-109 pilot could flip inverted, dive vertically, sustain negative G for 10 seconds straight. His engine never even hiccuped. Luftwaffe tacticians had identified this vulnerability within weeks of initial engagements. Their counter-strategy was brutally simple. When a British fighter latches onto your tail, dive hard. The Spitfire will follow. Its engine will cut out. You either escape clean or circle back and finish him while he's defenseless. They had a name for it: the English disease. They exploited it in every single engagement. Fighter Command was aware of the problem. They'd been aware since 1937. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had authored detailed reports, submitted formal recommendations, proposed multiple modifications. Nothing materialized. The Air Ministry had competing priorities, production quotas, budget constraints, internal debates about whether the problem was genuinely as severe as the engineers insisted. Then, the Battle of Britain erupted. Between July and October 1940, RAF pilots logged engine cutouts in 43% of all diving attacks. 43%. Almost half of every aggressive maneuver terminated with a dead engine. Squadron commanders calculated that 80 to 100 pilot fatalities were directly attributable to the carburetor defect. Men who'd had Germans perfectly lined up in their sights, men who'd executed everything correctly, men who died because their engines failed them at the most critical moment imaginable. Rolls-Royce was developing a solution, a pressure carburetor. Complete redesign of the fuel delivery system incorporating injection principles similar to the German engines. Projected completion, late 1943. The RAF couldn't afford to wait 3 years. They were hemorrhaging pilots faster than replacement training could supply them. Every single week, experienced airmen were dying because of a float chamber engineered for peacetime conditions. The file reached Beatrice Shilling's desk in November 1940. Principal Technical Officer, Carburetor Research and Development, the sole female engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She studied the combat reports methodically. She analyzed the maintenance records. She conducted interviews with pilots who'd survived engine failures. She grasped the fundamental problem within a week. Solving it would consume 4 months. Testing it would put her entire career at risk. If you want to discover how one woman's elegantly simple invention saved thousands of RAF pilots, hit that like button. It helps us bring more forgotten wartime stories to light. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to Shilling. Shilling wasn't destined to become an engineer. Born in 1909 in Waterlooville, a modest town in Hampshire, her father operated a butcher shop. Girls from families like hers typically became secretaries, nurses, or shopkeepers. Shilling had different ambitions. At 14, she purchased a broken motorcycle using money she'd saved from various odd jobs. Her parents assumed she wanted to ride it. She wanted to comprehend it. She disassembled the engine down to its smallest individual components, studied what each piece did, reconstructed it on her bedroom floor better than it had been originally. At 25, she raced that very motorcycle at Brooklands, hitting 106 miles per hour around the concrete banking. She earned the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, one of only 3 women in history to receive that honor. Racing taught her something no textbook ever could: how engines responded under extreme stress, when they broke down, why they broke down, how to sense a problem developing before the gauges registered it. Now she was the RAF's carburetor specialist, and their carburetors were killing pilots. The solution crystallized in her mind in January 1941. Elementary physics. If the problem stemmed from excessive fuel during negative G, restrict the fuel flow. Not entirely, just sufficiently to prevent flooding. The engine would still receive what it required, just not enough to drown itself. A brass disc with a precisely sized hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line upstream of the carburetor. Calibrate the hole to permit exactly enough fuel for maximum power output, and no more. She machined the initial prototype personally, tested 17 different hole diameters, ran simulation after simulation for 6 weeks. The optimal diameter, 0.04 inches. Bench tests produced perfect results. Engine cutouts plummeted from 2 seconds to a fraction of a heartbeat, too brief to matter in actual combat. But bench tests weren't combat. Shilling needed to validate it in a real dogfight. The obstacle was authorization. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF aircraft constituted a court-martial offense. The Air Ministry mandated 6 months of rigorous testing, review committees, safety certifications, bureaucratic paperwork that would consume more time than pilots had left to live. Shilling possessed 6 brass restrictors and a decision to make. She could wait for proper authorization, follow established procedure, conduct everything by the book, or she could save lives immediately and face whatever consequences followed. On March 17, 1941, she loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors, rode 40 miles through the English countryside to RAF Biggin Hill. Morning patrols were in preparation. Ground crews swarmed across Spitfires and Hurricanes, inspecting engines, loading ammunition. Shilling located the chief mechanic, a sergeant named Harris. He'd been maintaining Merlin engines since before the war started. 16 years of hands-on experience, hands that recognized every bolt and wire in the Merlin by touch alone. She showed him the brass disc, explained the underlying physics, told him she needed to install it in an aircraft without authorization, without documentation, without anyone in the command structure knowing. Harris rotated the restrictor between his oil-stained fingers. Such a tiny thing, such an absurdly simple thing.
"How do you know it actually works?" he asked. "Bench tests, 6 full weeks of them, perfect results every single time." "Bench tests aren't combat." "I know, that's precisely why I'm here." Harris glanced toward the Spitfires on the flight line, young pilots climbing into cockpits, young men trusting their engines to keep them breathing. "I've lost 11 pilots to engine cutouts," he said quietly. 11 good men. Peterson, Williams, that Scottish kid, McLeod, couldn't have been older than 20. He looked at Shilling, then back at the restrictor in his palm. "If this thing works, I don't give a damn if the king himself hasn't signed off on it." He grabbed his welding kit and walked directly toward the nearest Spitfire. Flight Lieutenant Al Deere was among the most experienced pilots in Fighter Command, a New Zealander. 54 combat missions, 7 confirmed kills. He'd been shot down twice, survived a mid-air collision, walked away from a crash landing that should have killed him outright. He'd also filed engine failure reports 4 times, all during diving attacks, all within the previous 3 months. On March 17th, his Spitfire became the first aircraft fitted with Shilling's restrictor. He had no idea. Nobody informed him. If the modification failed catastrophically, Shilling wanted the blame to land squarely on her, not on a pilot who'd had 0 say in the matter.
Harris welded the restrictor into the fuel line in under 2 minutes, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. Deere climbed into the cockpit at 07:15. Standard morning patrol, 2 hours over the channel, scanning for German formations. Shilling stood at the edge of the airfield, her heart hammered in her chest, her hands remained steady. If the restrictor performed as designed, Deere would never notice any difference. If it failed, if it starved the engine completely, if the weld cracked open, if the hole diameter was wrong, Deere would drop from the sky, and Shilling would spend the remainder of her life knowing she'd killed him. The Spitfire's Merlin thundered to life. Deere taxied to the runway, released brakes, accelerated down the strip, lifted smoothly into the air. Shilling watched him climb until the Spitfire became nothing but a speck against the gray English sky. Then she waited. The minutes dragged past, each one stretched like an hour. She paced the airfield perimeter, checked her watch obsessively, calculated fuel consumption rates in her head. 2 hours of patrol, perhaps 2.5 if Deere extended his route. Ground crews moved around her. Mechanics serviced other aircraft. The war proceeded as if nothing extraordinary was unfolding. For them, nothing was. For Shilling, everything was. She'd tested engine modifications before, published technical papers, presented at conferences, but she'd never gambled a man's life on her work, never dispatched someone into mortal combat with a piece of equipment that existed solely because she believed it would function. Belief wasn't proof, and if she was wrong, belief wouldn't bring Deere back. Harris found her at the 1-hour mark, brought her a cup of tea. She accepted it but didn't drink. Her stomach was too knotted for tea. "He's a damn good pilot," Harris said. "Best in the squadron. If anyone can properly test your gadget, it's him." Shilling nodded. She'd selected Deere for exactly that reason. Experienced, aggressive, the type of pilot who'd commit to a dive without a moment's hesitation, the type who'd discover quickly whether the restrictor functioned or didn't. 90 minutes. The patrol should be concluding soon. Deere would be turning back toward Biggin Hill, assuming everything had proceeded normally, assuming his engine hadn't failed over the channel, assuming he wasn't floating in a life jacket right now, watching his Spitfire sink into the cold gray water, assuming he wasn't already dead. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, Deere's Spitfire materialized over the airfield. Shilling spotted it first. She'd been staring at the sky for so long her eyes ached. One aircraft, no smoke, no visible damage. Deere landed smoothly, taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, and emerged from the cockpit. He was grinning. Pilots didn't grin after routine patrols. They looked exhausted, tense, relieved to still be alive. Deere looked like a man who'd just uncovered a secret. Harris reached him first. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Deere pulled off his helmet. "Problems? That was the best the Merlin's ever run." He'd encountered 2 BF-109s over the channel. They'd spotted him, turned to engage, then dove hard when he maneuvered behind them. The standard German escape tactic. Deere had pursued without hesitation. Full negative G, stick jammed forward. The exact dive that should have murdered his engine. The Merlin never stuttered. Full power maintained through the entire maneuver. Deere had closed to 150 yards before the German pilots realized something was fundamentally wrong. He'd struck one of them, watched pieces tear off the Messerschmitt's tail. The German had limped toward France, trailing black smoke. First confirmed damage Deere had inflicted during a diving attack since August. "I don't know what maintenance did to this aircraft," Deere said, "but I want it done to every single Spitfire in the squadron." Harris glanced at Shilling. Shilling stared at the ground. "I think that can be arranged, sir," Harris said. Word propagated through fighter command like wildfire. Biggin Hill installed restrictors in every aircraft within 48 hours. Pilots reported flawless engine performance. Diving attacks that would have ended in failure now terminated in kills. Squadron commanders from Hornchurch called, from Kenley, from Tangmere and Northolt and Manston. What had Biggin Hill done to their engines? How could they obtain it? The Air Ministry discovered the situation within a week. Shilling anticipated fury. She expected court-martial threats. She expected her career to implode. Instead, she received a phone call. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of 11 Group, the man personally responsible for every fighter squadron defending London and southeast England.
"Miss Shilling," he said, "I've just finished reading the combat reports from Biggin Hill. I'm told you're responsible." Shilling braced herself. "Yes, sir." "How quickly can you install this device in every aircraft in fighter command?" Shilling blinked. "Sir?" "You heard me correctly. How quickly?" She performed the calculations in her head. 43 stations, 3,000 engines. If she trained installation teams at each base, operated around the clock, prioritized frontline squadrons first. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 5 if Rolls-Royce can manufacture the restrictors fast enough. "You have 4, Park said. "I'll handle the authorization paperwork. You handle the installation. Don't disappoint me." Shilling assembled a team of 3 engineers and rode her Norton to every fighter station in southern England. Biggin Hill was merely the beginning. Then Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, Northolt, Manston, Hawkinge, Gravesend, Coltishall. 43 stations in 4 weeks. She plotted her route like a military campaign. Hit the frontline squadrons first, expand outward from there. She trained ground crews personally, demonstrated the installation procedure, supervised the initial fittings at each base, inspected every weld, measured every hole diameter, rejected any restrictor that failed to meet her exact specifications.
She slept in hangars when time permitted sleep, ate sandwiches on her motorcycle when it didn't, rode through spring rain and occasional German bombing raids. Some stations welcomed her enthusiastically. The pilots at Hornchurch lined up to shake her hand after their first successful diving attacks with the restrictor installed. Others didn't quite know what to make of her, a woman issuing orders to their mechanics, a civilian instructing RAF personnel on how to modify their aircraft. At one station, a wing commander flatly refused to authorize the installation, told her to return when she possessed proper documentation from the Air Ministry. Shilling produced Air Vice Marshal Park's direct authorization. The wing commander's face went pale. The installation proceeded without further objection. At another station, a young pilot asked her what she'd accomplished to merit such a critical assignment. "I'm good at it," she said simply. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." By April 20th, every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had a restrictor fitted. 2,847 Merlin engines, 4 weeks of relentless work. The device required an official designation. The RAE labeled it the RAE restrictor. The pilots called it something entirely different. Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, coined the nickname that stuck, Miss Shilling's Orifice. Crude RAF humor, Shilling didn't object. If a vulgar joke helped pilots remember who'd saved them, she'd gladly accept it. The results were immediate and irrefutable. Fighter Command meticulously tracked every statistic, every engagement, every kill, every loss. March 1941, before the restrictor. Engine cutouts in 41% of diving attacks. Kill-to-loss ratio 1.4 to 1. 51 British fighters lost, 73 German aircraft destroyed. April 1941, after the restrictor. Engine cutouts in 0.3% of diving attacks. Kill-to-loss ratio 3.1 to 1. 27 British fighters lost, 84 German aircraft destroyed. The transformation was immediate, quantifiable, undeniable. Pilot confidence shifted overnight. Men who'd hesitated to fully commit to dives now pressed their attacks without a second thought. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's leading aces, described the change in a letter to his family. "It's like flying an entirely different aircraft. Before, every dive was a gamble. Would the engine keep running or wouldn't it? You'd hesitate for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction could get you killed. Now there's no hesitation. The Merlin runs perfectly. No matter what I do, I can fight exactly the way I've always wanted to fight." Flying Officer Johnny Johnson, who would eventually become the RAF's highest-scoring ace, flew his first combat missions in April 1941. "The older pilots told me about the engine failures," Johnson recalled years later. "They said you had to be extremely careful in a dive. Your Merlin might quit on you." By the time I started flying combat missions, that problem had vanished. Miss Shilling had eliminated it. I never thought twice about diving on a German. That probably saved my life a dozen times. Squadron leader Douglas Bader, the legendary pilot who flew with 2 prosthetic legs, credited the restrictor with completely transforming his tactics. "Before Shilling, we fought defensively. We were genuinely afraid of our own engines. After Shilling, we fought the way fighter pilots are supposed to fight. Aggressive, committed, zero hesitation. She returned our confidence." Flight Officer Johnny Deere, the same man who'd unknowingly tested the very first restrictor, became one of its most passionate advocates.
"I didn't know I was the guinea pig until weeks afterward," Dear wrote in his memoirs. "When Miss Shilling finally told me what she'd done, I wasn't angry. I was profoundly grateful. She took a personal risk on me so that thousands of other pilots wouldn't have to face the same risk. That requires genuine courage."
Luftwaffe intelligence detected the change within weeks. After-action reports from April noted that British fighters were no longer breaking off diving attacks. The tactical advantage had evaporated completely. By May 1941, German tactical manuals had quietly deleted the section about exploiting British engine failures. The English disease had been cured by a woman with a brass washer and the courage to break every rule. The restrictor remained in active service until 1943. Rolls-Royce finally delivered the pressure carburetor that year, the proper engineering solution. Fuel injection principles, no float chamber, no flooding potential. But converting existing aircraft required 8 hours per engine. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons for that duration, so the restrictors stayed. Many aircraft flew with Miss Shilling's orifice until 1944, some until the war's end. Pilots trusted it implicitly. Ground crews knew how to install it blindfolded. The device cost less than £1 to manufacture, a brass washer keeping pilots alive for 4 years. Shilling didn't stop working after the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment faced endless problems, each one potentially fatal to pilots, each one demanding a solution. She developed cold start modifications for Spitfires deployed to Russia. Arctic temperatures in Murmansk plummeted to -40 degrees. Fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died within hours. Engine oil transformed into thick sludge. British pilots couldn't start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews had never encountered a Merlin engine before. Shilling designed a cold start procedure utilizing preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. She authored a manual simple enough for Russian mechanics to follow. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk through the brutal winter of 1941-42. She researched high-altitude performance characteristics. Late-war Spitfires operated at 35,000 feet, pursuing German reconnaissance aircraft and high-altitude bombers. At that altitude, air density was minimal. Oxygen was scarce. Fuel mixture demanded precise calibration. Too rich and the engine flooded. Too lean and it overheated catastrophically. Shilling developed altitude-compensating modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Test pilots reported superior climb rates, enhanced maneuverability, improved chances of intercepting Germans who believed they were safe at high altitude. By 1945, she'd completed 17 major projects at Farnborough. Cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, supercharger efficiency enhancements. Each project saved lives. None achieved the fame of the restrictor. She married George Naylor in 1938, a mathematician at the RAE who later flew bombers with 625 Squadron, 31 missions over Germany, Distinguished Flying Cross. Bomber Command maintained the highest casualty rate of any RAF branch. 1 in 2 didn't survive the war. Every time Naylor took off, the statistics suggested he might not return. Shilling understood those odds better than most. She'd calculated probability for a living. She knew exactly how razor-thin the margin was between life and death at 20,000 feet over Germany. Naylor beat the odds, came home in 1944. They never discussed what he'd witnessed. He never asked about her work. Some things are better preserved in silence. In 1948, King George VI appointed Shilling an Officer of the Order of the British Empire. She traveled to Buckingham Palace, received the medal, posed for photographs with the king. A reporter asked her what the secret to her success was.
Solving problems, she said. That's all engineering really is. Someone has a problem, you identify a solution, you make it function. The reporter asked if being a woman had made her career more difficult. Shilling shrugged. I didn't have time to think about being a woman. I was too occupied being an engineer. The following morning, she was back at Farnborough working on jet engine problems. She never reached director-level positions. Those were reserved exclusively for men, unwritten rules that nobody acknowledged, but everyone faithfully followed. She never complained publicly. She preferred actual engineering to administrative paperwork. After the war, she worked on the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile. She researched wet runway braking characteristics. Landing accidents were killing more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. She published 3 technical papers on how water on runways affected tire friction, dry physics that saved wet landings.
She helped design a bobsled for the RAF Olympic team. Strange project for an aeronautical engineer, but bobsled design involved identical principles she'd already mastered: aerodynamics, weight distribution, friction management. The team used her design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. In bobsledding, that qualifies as success. In 1967, Dan Gurney's Eagle Mk1 Formula One car developed an overheating problem that his entire team of engineers couldn't solve. Someone suggested calling that old lady who'd fixed the Spitfires during the war. Shilling was 58 years old. She examined the cooling system for 2 hours, asked questions, took measurements, performed calculations. Then she identified the solution. Engineers half her age with degrees from the finest universities couldn't fix what she solved in an afternoon. It's the same as any other engine problem, she told the team. You understand the physics, you identify the simplest solution, you make it work. She retired in 1969, spent her final years the way she'd spent her earliest years, working on motorcycles, restoring vintage machines, racing at classic events, maintaining the Norton she'd owned since she was 14, the motorcycle that had taught her how engines behaved under stress. She died on November 18, 1990, 81 years old. The obituaries focused on one thing: the brass washer, Miss Shilling's orifice. Everything else was relegated to footnotes. Today, a pub in Farnborough is named the Tilly Shilling. The Brooklands Museum displays her racing trophies. Universities have buildings bearing her name. Engineering schools teach the restrictor as a case study. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results. But the real lesson isn't about engineering. It's about courage.
In March 1941, Beatrice Shilling faced a choice. She could follow established procedure, wait for proper authorization, file endless paperwork, and attend committee meetings while pilots died. Or she could load a motorcycle with brass washers and fix the problem herself. She chose action. She risked her career, her reputation, possibly her freedom. She installed an unauthorized modification in a combat aircraft and sent a pilot into battle without informing him. If she'd been wrong, she would have been court-martialed, imprisoned, destroyed. She wasn't wrong. Thousands of pilots came home because of what she did. Thousands of families remained intact. Thousands of futures were lived instead of being buried in military cemeteries. One woman, one motorcycle, one brass washer with a hole in it, and the courage to act when everyone else was waiting for permission. That's how you change history. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like signals YouTube to share this story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue forgotten heroes from history every week. Real people, real courage. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering Beatrice Shilling. She saved thousands of lives, and almost nobody knows her name.